Thank you, and good morning, everyone. To the committee's December meeting, which is online. The meeting is being broadcast live and can be accessed via the council's meeting YouTube site. And in the future, members of the press and public may record and take photographs, except where they are confidential or exempt items, of which there are none that I've been informed of. So we'll just move on to the next item on the agenda, which is apologies. Have we had any apologies?
Yes, Chair, we've had apologies from Councillors Zahir Khan and Peter Griffith. Councillor Lal has also given his apologies for lateness, so he will join us in a while.
Thank you, Basima. Although we're not in a formal meeting, I'd like to take the opportunity to aid transparency and ask members to declare any interests, if any. Okay, I can't see anyone indicating. Otherwise, we'll move on to our main item for discussion today, which is looking at the impact of the clean air zone on businesses that fall within the zone since it was introduced in June this year. I'd like to welcome Stephen Arnold, who's the head of the clean air zone, who's going to talk us through the key points as set out in his presentation that was included in the agenda pack. I'll then open it up for discussion to questions. So over to you, Stephen.
Good morning, Chair, and good morning, councillors, and thank you for the opportunity to present to you this morning. So what I'll do is I'll just share the presentation. I'll just run through that as quickly as possible, so I'm sure there's a number of questions that you'd like to ask. So let's just pull up the right presentation. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that now. Okay, so thank you. The other thing as well, just to add, is that my broadband seems to be playing up this morning, as luck would have it. So if I do drop off or get a bit crackly, please just let me know. And so apologies for that. I'm not sure if it's the storm or what's going on there, but it's always the way with some of this stuff. So Birmingham's Clean Air Zone became operational on the 1st of June, and the purpose of the Clean Air Zone was to, or is to, reduce the levels of nitrogen dioxide in the shortest possible time. And I say that because that is the sort of reference point that we have, because that is in the terms of the ministerial direction that was handed to the council. With the first one that was handed to the council was back in December 2017. There was a further ministerial direction to implement the plans that had been presented in March of 2019, once those plans have been accepted. As part of the preparation for the business case for the Clean Air Zone, there was a distributional impact assessment. So what I'm trying to do through today's presentation is refer back to that in terms of the key groups that were identified, the impacts on business that were identified, and then the mitigations that were put in place, and then how those are actually operating in reality, and what we're finding, and how we're trying to adjust to that, because we've now got quite a good body of data. It's still very early days, I think, and I need to be really clear about that. So we're still super cautious around what the data is telling us, and we need more. We always need more, and you need to see that over the course of time. But again, we're already starting to think about some of the potential additional steps and measures that we can make to ease the transition. I think the other important thing to stress within this as well is over the course of the last 18 months to 2 years, COVID has had a profound impact on individuals and businesses, economic activity across the city and the region. And the other significant external factor as well is Brexit. And we know that has had a significant impact on supply chains, especially around new vehicles, but where that has potentially caused some problems, other areas of, for instance, of the automotive sector have benefited. So from the second-hand market, for instance, has certainly benefited from some of those supply issues with new vehicles. So it in some ways it is very, very difficult for us to strip out the specific impact of the clean air zone on business activity within the city in the light of some of those other things. But what we've been looking at is, and this comes in the latter part of the presentation, is just what some of those impacts of COVID in particular have been, and then aligning that to the introduction of the clean air zone and then what's happening. And also as well within this, what I've tried to do is to look at how that activity then also compares with the other core cities, because those are our nearest comparators. So since the introduction of the clean air zone, we've been capturing data through the ANPR cameras, the automatic number plate recognition cameras. So those are used to support the enforcement of the clean air zone. So at the very beginning of the clean air zone, there were around about 100,000 unique vehicles entering the zone every day on average. That dropped a little bit through the latter part of June into July and August. That coincides really with the school holiday period, and that tends to be a period of lower volumes going through the that part of the city. But in September and October, once schools start to go back, and when we start to get colder weather as well, people tend to go to use their cars more. The volume of vehicles has actually recovered and is actually slightly higher than it was when we started the scheme at the beginning of June. So at the moment, as at the end of October, there's around about 102, just over 100,000 unique vehicles entering the zone each and every day. So the key thing for us that we're looking at here in terms of achieving that goal of reducing the levels of nitrogen dioxide is the percentage of compliant and non-compliant vehicles entering the zone each and every day. And what we've seen is that since the beginning of the scheme, at the beginning of the scheme, there was around about 18.7, just under 19% of all unique vehicles each day entering the zone were not compliant, so they were subject to the daily fee. Now, at the end of October, what we're seeing is that has reduced down to 10.2%. So that's quite a significant change in a very short period of time. But again, we're really, really cautious about reading too much into that. But we see that as very much as a lead indicator that reduction in the percentage of non-compliant vehicles will lead to an improvement in the levels of nitrogen dioxide. And then once we start to look at the vehicle categories, so that the chart at the top of this page looks at compliance across all of the vehicle categories, the key vehicle categories, and then the bar at the bottom looks at the relative composition of the overall fleet. So passenger vehicles account for around about 80% of all unique vehicles entering the zone each day. Vans account for the second biggest category at 9%. And what you can see there is that the level of compliance within passenger cars, which has the greatest percentage of vehicles entering the zone each day, is steadily improving. The other thing that I'd point out with this graph as well is these charts are that for HGVs and coaches, compliance is above 90%, and for coaches in particular, it's at about 98, 99%. Which is really, really significant, because prior to the launch of the clean air zone, a lot of the modelling that we were doing was suggesting that for HGVs and coaches in particular, compliance would be around the 60% mark, but actually it's significantly higher. We know that for the buses and the coaches, a lot of the volume that comes from that category is down to National Express West Midlands, and they've made a lot of work in terms of upgrading their fleet and ensuring that only compliant vehicles are entering the clean air zone. So even before the scheme was launched, the clean air zone was having a positive impact in terms of encouraging behaviour. The other category that I'd highlight within this chart is the vans. Vans at the moment account for around about 9% of all unique vehicles entering the zone, so that's the second biggest category. And at the moment, compliance is around about 77%. When the early modelling was done for the clean air zone, we estimated that at around about 2020, 2021, around about the time that the scheme was due to launch, compliance in this group would be at around about 80%. So it's slightly below, but it is very much very close to what that original modelling was suggesting. And I'll talk a little bit more, and I'll talk a little bit more about why I've stressed that as well a little bit later. The other thing that we've done is that prior to the launch of the scheme, and through the work that we did around the impact assessment, was identified the potential impacts on residents and low-income workers in the city centre, and that's where exemptions came into place, and also some of the financial incentives such as the scrappage scheme and the travel credit scheme for low-income workers in the city centre, because there was a desire there to support those lower income workers who were more likely to have to come into the city centre for their jobs, and were more reliant on their cars, and to provide them with more time to prepare. So around about 63, just over 60% of all of the temporary local exemptions that have been issued have been to low-income workers. All this data is as at the end of October, and around about 31% have been issued to residents. So residents get a 2-year exemption, low-income workers get a 12-month exemption. And as I said before, once that exemption starts to run out, they are most likely to be eligible for the scrappage scheme. So that gives them the opportunity to apply for a grant of around £2,000. Sorry, not around £2,000, £2,000 to scrap their vehicle and use that towards a new compliant vehicle, or take the £2,000 towards a travel credit. So this chart just shows where we're up to in terms of the financial incentives. The financial grants for the taxi community have been the most popular to date, and there's a chart that follows after this that just talks about some of the change that we're already seeing within the taxi fleet. The heavy duty vehicle fund, which was created to support SMEs with HGVs and coaches, and those coaches and HGVs were operating in the clean air zone, has been less. There are a couple of reasons for that, one of which was due to some of the restrictions around state aid, which we've now been able to relax because state aid rules have fallen away and have been replaced by a subsidy control regime. So we've introduced those, and we think that will make that more attractive. We think the other thing as well that's been that's made this less popular is just the sheer the very high level of compliance within the HGV and coach fleet. So it's above, as I said before, it's above 90%. So the actual number of vehicles that are potentially eligible for this grant are a lot smaller than what we'd originally envisaged. So as I was talking about before, with the vans have a compliance rate around about 77%. So we think that there's some more work that we can do around supporting change for commercial vans. It was one of the areas that we highlighted in the original impact assessment, and it was a mitigation that we did submit within the full business case. It was rejected by the government at the time, but we think there's more that we can do in that area. So we're working hard to develop some options around that. But any change to the way in which any of the financial grants are used is subject to approval from the government. So we're working through that process at the moment, but we hope to be able to talk about that in the not too distant future. The other grant that's included on this slide is the vehicle scrappage scheme. So to date, there have been around about 130 applications to the scheme, which is okay. But again, it's not as popular. Originally, this particular package was expected to be launched towards the end of the exemption, because it was a route from the exemption into doing something different. We decided to launch it earlier because we wanted to give people access to this as early as possible, so that they could make that change more early. And it also helped, ideally, it would help to remove non-compliant vehicles from the road earlier. But we expect this interest in this to pick up in the new year. So this next chart looks at some of the changes that we're already starting to see or have seen within the taxi fleet in particular. So the blue lines at the top shows the level of compliance within the private hire fleet and the Hackney carriage fleet. The private hire fleet accounts for around about 75% of all Birmingham licensed taxis. Hackney's around about 25%. And at the moment, private hires are around about 90% compliant. So that's really positive. And that's quite a significant move from 2018 when we first started tracking this. And you can see that line growing quite steadily, even during lockdown. For the Hackney carriages, the rate of compliance is less, but it's still, it's at the moment, it's close to 40%, which is really, really positive. And once we introduced an additional grant for Euro 6 compliant vehicles, we've seen interest in the scheme accelerate. One of the other things that we've been looking at as well is the overall number of licensed Hackney carriages has reduced since 2018 quite significantly, but a lot of that reduction took place during shortly after the first lockdown. There was a reduction of around about 25% where licenses were handed back. But once the taxi grants were launched in October of 2020, that rate of change reduced a lot. So we think that's helped to stabilize and help to support the trade through this difficult period. And as that top line shows, the rate of compliance is starting to accelerate. So that's really positive. These next couple of slides really just look a little bit at the air quality monitoring that's going on and the outputs from that. So we've got a network of just over 90 plus air quality monitoring stations. So there's around about 80 diffusion tubes, 11 continuous analyzers, and then 15 indicative sensors. And all of the data that we capture from these sensors is published either in real time with the automatic analyzers or on an annualized basis through the air quality annual status report, and all that data is published through the Birmingham Air Quality website. So it's freely available, and we know that others are starting to look at that data and do their own analysis around the impact of the clean air zone on air quality. So for instance, there was a report in the newspaper a couple of months ago, maybe 3 months ago, using some of the data that we've published. It was done by the University of Sheffield, and that was suggesting that air quality had improved at a number of locations. But again, from our perspective, we're super cautious about that. We will be publishing an interim update around on the baseline report that we published in July of this year. We'll be publishing that in the new year, and then we'll publish a full update after 12 months of operation, because that will enable us to look at an annualized data, and that's the basis that the air quality data is reported through the air quality annual status report. And this slide really just sets out the various outputs that we've got. A lot of the data that we capture goes to JACU, that's the Joint Air Quality Unit, which is run by the government, and then there's monthly fact sheets that we publish. There was the baseline report, there's a 6-month report that we're doing on air quality and traffic, and then there's the 12-month report as well. So we're being very transparent and open around a lot of this data, and we want to share it, and we're looking at ways in which we can make that data a lot more accessible as well through the use of interactive dashboards and other things like that. So all of the data over the next few slides is taken from the Centre for Cities. They've got they're capturing data around the high street recovery from COVID, and that enables you to look at pretty much every single city across the UK, compare it against an average, and then what's actually happening. So I've just been looking at, to start off with, looking at Birmingham, but also looking at some of the core cities. So what this is showing us here is that that there was a significant drop in terms of economic activity at the beginning of 2020, which is at the point at which the first lockdown took place. There was a mini recovery, not not up to the full levels of pre-COVID. Then there was a drop again when the second lockdown happened. Economic activity didn't reduce to the same sort of levels as the first lockdown, but then steadily it's been increasing as the restrictions have been eased. And I think it'll be interesting to see just what sorts of impact some of the if there's any additional restrictions that come out of this latest variant and what that might be. So what this data also does as well, it breaks it down between weekends and weekdays, because there are differences here between what happens each of those periods. This next slide looks at then, so the black line in the middle is the average for all cities that the data's been captured, not just the core cities, all cities that are captured within the Centre for Cities tracker. And what you can see there is that more or less all of the core cities are in line with the average. There's a few that are performing slightly better, and there are some that are performing slightly worse. But for Birmingham, we're more or less tracking against that average line. So in line with the rest of the country in terms of recovery. The chart at the bottom shows a split between where people are coming from. The blue line is from people outside of the city. The purple is inside. So that enables us to say, so where is spend coming from? Where are people coming from? So this next slide really looks at the difference between what's happening during the week and then what's happening on the weekend. I think the interesting thing from this is that the weekend activity is more or less at pre-COVID levels. By comparison, weekday activity is still below pre-COVID levels. So the theory with this is that because Birmingham City Centre relies a lot on people working in offices, that footfall isn't there during the week because a lot of people are working from home. This meeting itself is a prime example of how organisations have adapted to a different working environment. Whereas at the weekend, more people come out, they're going out for more leisure activities, they've got more free time. So there are more people coming into the city during the weekend. And similarly for the nighttime economy as well, what this graph shows is that the activity weekends and during the week is at more or less the pre-COVID level. So 100 is pre-COVID, and that was up until the end of November. So people are coming back into the city centre based on this data, and for certain parts of the week, it's at more or less pre-COVID levels. This next slide is data from Transport for West Midlands, and what this looks at is the number of people using different modes of transport, and then also some of the percentages as well. And what I've also done there is put in markers there around when the different lockdowns took place and when the restrictions were removed. And what you can see here is quite clearly with bus, for instance, bus journeys are more or less at the same sort of level that they were pre-COVID, but for trains, that still needs to recover to pre-COVID levels. So that's been quite interesting to look at. And then the slide on the left, sorry, not the slide on the left, the graph on the left looks at the different modes of travel, and you can see that those lines also compare with the way in which the various lockdowns occurred, and they also align quite nicely as well to the economic activity graphs that were in the previous slides. So there is a correlation there between COVID, the various lockdown restrictions, the easing of those restrictions, and then the impact that has on travel behaviours. So I suppose the final couple of slides really is just think about the next step. So Birmingham is not the only city that's introduced a clean air zone. Bath introduced its clean air zone in March. Portsmouth's introduced its clean air zone just last week, the 29th of November. But next year, Bradford, Bristol, Greater Manchester, Sheffield, Newcastle, they're all planning launches of a clean air zone. Liverpool is talking about introducing a clean air zone. But you've also got other similar schemes. London expanded its ULEZ in October to include a much bigger area. Oxford's looking at a zero emissions zone, and cities in Scotland such as Glasgow, Edinburgh, Dundee and Aberdeen are also looking at a low emission zones. Those aren't part of the government's clean air zone programme, but they are going to operate in a very similar way. There will be an application of a daily fee on non-compliant vehicles to a particular emission standard in order to improve air quality or create some kind of behaviour change. So they're very, very similar in terms of operation. I think the final thing to stress as well is that the clean air zone is not going to improve air quality on its own. It will have a significant impact, but we always said that the clean air zone required additional measures to create the changes that we expect and to also make those sustainable. So some of the ways in which the clean air zone is also enabling changes through support for the expansion of the city's electric vehicle charging network. So that's the fast and rapid network that's being rolled out at the moment. The schemes also supported the purchase of the 20 hydrogen buses, and those have started to come into operation from the beginning of this week. We're also looking at the purchase of up to 50 electric Hackney carriages to support change within the taxi fleet, and we'll be looking at that probably on a try before you buy basis. So that the introduction of that scheme has also been aligned to the work around the fast and rapid network. But the other thing as well with the clean air zone is that longer term, it's hoped and expected that it helps to enable change within the transport strategy by encouraging people to do something different. And that's especially true for shorter journeys. Whilst the clean air zone will help to reduce the percentage of non-compliant vehicles, the most polluting vehicles entering the clean air zone, help to encourage the owners and the drivers of those to do something different. What we're also wanting to do as well is to say to everybody else is to think about leaving your car at home more often. It doesn't have to be all the time, because we know that around about 25% of all the journeys made in the city by car are less than a mile. Those journeys could be made on foot, they could be made by bike, they could be made on public transport. So there's a much broader change here that the clean air zone is hoping to change. Some of that is built into the updated transport strategy. Some of that is part of the Route to Zero work, and also some of that is in the future city plan as well, in terms of trying to create a much more greener and sustainable environment that's a lot more focused on people rather than vehicles. So thank you very much for your time. And I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Stephen, for that report. Quite a lot of information to take in. I mean, I'll begin by saying I try to be sensible and go travel on the train over the weekend and not take my car. And then the trains were all cancelled and there was chaos. Which meant that I had to wait 2 hours in the freezing cold for the next train, and then the next day I had to travel again. So I took my car. So I think many members will kind of agree that, you know, in terms of if we are to kind of change that mindset of people to travel more greener, I think we need to have a much more efficient sort of alternative for them. Mm-hmm. So I mean, I don't know if you want to comment on that before I take any questions.
So I wouldn't disagree with that. You know, it is difficult to encourage people to do something different if those alternatives are not reliable. unfortunately, we don't run the trains, but I know that there are numerous conversations with the operators of the trains about improving quality. I think the response from them at the moment is that they have been faced with a number of challenges around COVID in terms of training drivers and things like that. But no, I completely agree. It is difficult to encourage people to make change, especially at this time of year when it is cold and it does feel easier sometimes to get into a nice warm car. But if we are to create an environment that is more sustainable, it is easier for all of us, is better for all of us in terms of improved air quality, reduced carbon emissions, more active travel and all those sorts of things, then each of us needs to make change. And that is difficult because we've all got reasons why there are barriers to that. But in some way or other, just small changes can make a big difference.
Thank you, Stephen. I can see Councillor Morrell has raised his hand. So, Councillor, do you want to ask a question?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the presentation. It's a shame we didn't have the Cabinet member here today as well alongside you, but I thought the presentation was very good. The one thing that was missing was the pollution levels. Have we got any measurements at the moment of whether the clean air zone is actually doing its job and lowering the pollution levels in the city centre? You mentioned about public transport, just the chair did, and I totally agree with that. I had a lot of emails this weekend, last weekend actually, of people having problems with the trains and the buses actually, and there seemed to have been traffic chaos in the city centre. You also mentioned about vans as well. I appreciate the fact that you made an interesting point, which I agree with, which is that 25% of all journeys are within less than a mile, and we need to encourage these people to not drive their cars. I totally agree with that. But there are people that still require their vehicles, in particular the people who drive vans. And that was the one metric you said that you failed to reach your model or your target. And I think that's kind of predictable because it's difficult for people in vans to suddenly just switch to a kind of an alternative. And when we look at the impact on business, you know, the white van man, so to speak, is kind of the key target that we're really looking at. Now, on the economics, it's difficult to judge it at the moment because of COVID. COVID has kind of skewed everything. I think we'll probably get a better picture in 12 months' time, probably after a year, maybe even 2 years. But there are a few questions I've got. So the first one is how much, firstly, the pollution levels. I've already asked that question. Have we actually got any data on the pollution at the moment? Also, how much money has been raised at the moment? How much money is coming to the coffers? You mentioned taxes, but I'm interested to know, is that just the Birmingham fleet? Because if you go around Birmingham, you'll notice that a majority of our taxis aren't actually Birmingham licensed, they're Wolverhampton licensed. So are we actually measuring the Wolverhampton or the other taxi drivers as well? Is it just the Birmingham fleet? And additionally, what else have I written down here on my notes? Expanding the charging networks, you mentioned. Again, something else I totally endorse. But the other issue that we've got, which is kind of different to the clean air zone, but relevant to the point that was raised, is it's all good putting charging points around, but the electric cars in the future are also not going to be able to drive into the city centre if we're going to be pedestrianising everything. And at the moment, if you drive around the city centre, there's so much congestion being created because of the roadworks. So if you go down, two examples is on the Queensway Tunnel, as you come up by just by Paradise Circus, you used to be able to drive over that way where the tram is. There's now a barrier saying road closed. Now you can still go there if you're coming from Hyatt Hotel. And so what you have now is cars are going and they're going around the roadblock, which is causing more congestion. And if you go through the tunnel and you come out by the Jewellery Quarter, there's also it says road closed there. And it's been like this for about 6 months now. And this is causing a huge backlog of traffic. And for 6 months, there have not been any roadworks there. And you do kind of sit there and ponder. The cynic in me kind of thinks, is the council doing this on purpose to try and create the congestion to get people out their cars? So I thought, anyway, to conclude, I thought it was interesting about the electric car. If we want people to drive electric cars in the future, perhaps we should make the city centre accessible for those cars so they're able to actually drive around the city. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Morel. Stephen, do you want to come back, or do you want to take another question before?
No, sure. I'm happy to respond to those questions. So I think there were 5 in total. So the first one was around air quality and the data. So during the presentation, what I did talk about was the so we're capturing data around air quality all the time. We've got 90 at least 90 data collection points. Some of those there's around about 11 continuous analyzers, so we're getting data on not just nitrogen dioxide but a range of pollutants. We're getting that on a continuous basis, and that is all fed through. But we report that data, all of that data, on an annualized mean basis through the air quality annual status report. The reason we report it on an annualized basis is because that then evens out some of the seasonal variations. So that's why I've been very, very cautious about talking about the impact on air quality in the very short term, because it does fluctuate hour to hour, month to month, and so on and so on and so forth. And that's why we report it on an annualized basis. But what we have done, as I said before, is we published what we've called a baseline report for air quality that uses 2019 as the baseline, because that's deemed to be the last normal year. Because if we were to use 2020, then it would be abnormally low due to reduced traffic levels and things like that. So we will publish an update, an interim update using 6 months worth of air quality data, and we'll be publishing that in the new year, so late January, early February time. But independently of that, we know that, like I said, the University of Sheffield have done their own analysis of the data that we have been publishing through the continuous analyzers, and what that has suggested is that at a number of data collection points within the clean air zone, the air quality, the levels of nitrogen dioxide have reduced. And I think it was by about 15% based on that analysis. And that was published through the iNewspaper about 3 months ago. But again, I'm just being very, very cautious at this stage about reading too much into that, because we haven't verified the analysis that they've done on that. The other question that you asked was around vans. So what I didn't say was that it had been unsuccessful. What I did say was that in the original impact assessment, we modelled that around about 80% of vans entering the clean air zone would be compliant at around about the point at which the clean air zone was introduced. What we're seeing is that at the moment 77% are compliant. So it's very, very close. But at 77%, it is still quite a lot lower than some of the other categories. So, for instance, coaches, HGVs, etc. So we think that there's some additional work that we should do there. And as I said as well, we did identify a potential mitigation that we submitted in the full business case to the government. The government rejected that at that point in time, but that's why we think we should be doing some more around that. The question around taxis, now we're purely looking at Birmingham licensed taxis. But we do get data around the overall volume of taxis that are coming through. What we can't do is determine the compliance for all of those taxis, but we do get data around other taxis. It's important to differentiate as well between hackney carriages, which have a license to operate in the city centre, versus private hire. And for private hire, they tend to be more compliant because it's easier, and that there are more models of compliant vehicles available to private hire drivers. And they're cheaper to get into as well, versus hackney carriages, which are quite specific vehicles. So it's important to differentiate between the two. I think the other question you asked was around electric vehicles. So I think the important thing with this is that part of this behaviour change, and this is longer term, and this also fits into some of the goals around route to zero and reducing carbon emissions, is that we don't just want to transfer a journey in a polluting vehicle to a clean vehicle. And that's where encouraging people to think about public transport, more active travel starts to come into play. And that's one of the principles also that's built into the transport strategy, is about the movement of people rather than vehicles around the city centre. That's where the segments idea comes into play. This idea where you come into the city one way, you go out the same way, rather than using it as a way of travelling across. So I absolutely take your point about congestion, but longer term, as a city, we need to think about fewer vehicle journeys in general across the whole of the city and other forms of transport. But noting some of the comments that we had before about some of the challenges we've got at the moment with public transport, that's not always easy to do in the short term. But again, what we're trying to do here is think about the medium to longer term.
Thank you for that, Stephen. Councillor Cornish.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for the report, of which you state in the report early on the impact of the clean air zone on economy is difficult in the context of the impact of COVID. And we certainly would not disagree with the fact that lockdown has created huge problems, and we do have to move forward. Looking at the data, which again is very informative, and you have said that the air quality has improved somewhat, but we do have a long way to go. Going back to the word data, we as elected members, we actually are very, very keen and interested on the discussions we're having here, and I would agree with some of the things that my colleagues have already stated. But basically, as elected members, we're talking to local people, residents that love the city, want to shop there, and we're listening to what they're saying, actually, which is not as involved as everything comes over in data. They're not interested in the word data, an awful lot of them. They want to know what they can and can't do, and whether they're happy or not. Businesses in the city are being penalised at the moment, whatever we talk about, of the vans and everything delivery, but they're being penalised even more so at the moment due to the clean air zone charges imposed. It's the opportunity at the moment for them to improve their business and their cash flow, which they all desperately need. But there are, regardless of what data shows, they are bypassing the city. The public are fed up, totally fed up with restrictions, and that includes, of course, public transport, which is insufficient. It would have been wonderful. We know we have to move forward with clean air. We've got to actually improve the air quality. We know that. But it would have been good if we could have got public transport a lot better first, in advance. At least improvements, so that you have got, for those that want to come into the city, maybe the public transport is not sufficient at the moment, but maybe they could drive in, and on the outskirts, you have a park and ride. Now then, all that is a long way off, I would presume, but that would have been brilliant if we could have at least be talking about something like that, which we certainly aren't at the moment. And also, implementing the clean air zone charges at the moment is what majority of members of the public are talking about. We know this was implemented in June. However, that's not far away from where we are now, Christmas, and also with the Commonwealth Games next year. Was it considered at the time of putting that charge in, just as you did? Can it be reconsidered? No, I suppose not. But I'd like you just to give me some thoughts on where your decisions were on deciding on the clean air zone charges initially. That is what members of the public are saying. I'm going to go straight to Solihull. I'm going to go straight to wherever, rather than the city. They are totally fed up with it all. Sorry about that, but thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Cornish. And I suppose just to add onto that question, I mean, I know there was a lot of data presented, but do we have that kind of data where we can see people actually coming in using, for shopping and things like that? Do we have that kind of information available that, would show, people coming into the city for specific reasons?
Okay, so I think there's two questions there. So if Chair, if I could take the last one first. So in terms of the data that I've presented, what that shows is that there's the data enables you to look at spend and from where people are coming into the city. So you're able to look at so for Birmingham, I think during the weekday around about 35-40%. I mean, I need to double check the slides of people come from outside of the city centre into the city. But I think that the more difficult question to respond to within that is how many people are deciding to not come into the city and go somewhere else. But because a lot of that is hidden by the impact of COVID, because everything is suppressed anyway. Yeah, and that's what's shown by some of those graphs. But we do know that people are coming back into the city centre because those graphs show that. We know that the number of people coming into the city centre during the weekend is at more or less, or even slightly above, the levels that we were seeing pre-COVID. So to respond to the question, are people avoiding the city centre? That's not necessarily not necessarily shown out by that data. That I'm sure there are individual people who are saying, for whatever reason, I am not going to do this because of X, Y, and Z. Now, that I'm sure that's absolutely true. But overall, what the data is showing us is that people are coming back into the city centre. What we're seeing during the week is that the level, that the number of people and the spend during the week is lower than what it was pre-COVID. But again, a lot of that is down to the fact that the majority of people who would come into the city centre during the week work in offices. That creates footfall, that creates spend, that means people going out to coffee shops, lunch bars, also all those sorts of things, you know, going out doing a bit of shopping, taking their cars into local garages because it's easy to do that when they're at work. But if those people aren't coming into the city centre, spend, footfall will naturally be down. But like I said, what those graphs are showing us is that footfall and spend on the weekend and at night is at or above pre-COVID levels. Yeah, so you know, that's what the data is showing us. In terms of the first question around the pricing, I think that's a really interesting question. All of the local authorities introducing clean air zones are given a framework document of how to, or what a local authority needs to do when they're introducing a clean air zone. They're given that by the Joint Air Quality Unit, which is the government's unit that looks after the delivery of its NO2 plan. And within the framework, it sets out some of the things where a local authority has some leeway, other things that it has to do as part of the introduction of a clean air zone. That includes a banding for setting the daily fee. There's a low end and then there's a high end. With the daily fee that we've set, we're actually at the low end, £8 for passenger cars, taxis, small vans, £50 for heavy duty vehicles, trucks, those sorts of things. By comparison, Bath, who have introduced a Type C clean air zone, so they're not charging passenger cars because they've got a different type of air quality challenge, but they're charging £100 for heavy duty vehicles per day, and £9 for vans. London is charging £12.50 per day for passenger cars, and so on. So Birmingham is actually, the daily fee is actually at the lower end, but that was set based on the feedback that we had from the consultation that was run in the summer of 2018. So over 10,500 responses to that helped to shape what that where we would set the pricing for the daily fee. That was also set through extensive modelling, looking at what price point would encourage behaviour change without a significant negative impact. And that, again, that's why it was set at the lower end. So it's £8 for passenger cars and small vans, and £50 for heavy duty goods vehicles. But like I say, we are at the lower end of the spectrum, and by comparison with the other clean air zone authorities, it is significantly lower.
Thank you, Stephen. Councillor Morell?
No more questions, but thank you for the answers.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm just checking. Does anyone else have any questions? Okay, I can't see anyone else indicating that they have any further questions. So thank you so much for that presentation, Stephen. And I appreciate that. It's obviously 6 months is quite early days, and obviously we've got the impact of COVID as well, which makes it really difficult to kind of get a clear picture. So perhaps maybe when you have the 12 months report, that might be, if members of the committee are in agreement that we could look at it again and maybe have, you might have some more data at that time or a clearer picture.
Yeah, I'd welcome the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Stephen.
That's all right. Thank you.
Thank you. Apologies, members. I'm having a bit of difficulty with my camera. So we'll move on now to the next item on the agenda, which is our work programme. In January, we've got Councillor Jane Francis, Cabinet Member for Education, Skills and Culture, and Ilgan Youssef, who are going to be attending and discussing issues or discussing about skills issues. If members have anything in particular that they're keen on for Councillor Francis to provide further or specific details on, please can you let either myself or Basima know. Following yesterday's full council meeting, there was a few items that sort of came up. I think one of them was around the committee looking at planning enforcement. So I'd be keen on getting the committee's views on that. I'll send out an email with further details on some of the items that came up yesterday. And if there's anything else that members can think of that they want us to look at specifically, please do let us know. So we'll move on. But does anyone? Yeah, so we've got February and March are the two sort of months that we're looking for, that we'll be looking at. So we'll move on to the next item of the agenda, which is any other urgent business. So is there any other urgent business? I can't see anyone indicating anything there. So we'll move on to item 7, which is authority to chair and officers. Do you have the authority to act on your behalf between meetings?
Yes, Chair.
Thank you. Okay, so that's it for today then. Thank you all. Now, before I close the meeting, I just wish everybody here the very best for the new year. I don't think we're meeting now till the new year, and season's greetings for the festive period. Thank you and take care, everybody.
Thank you, Chair.
And Merry Christmas to you.
Thank you.
Merry Christmas. Bye-bye.